Martin, over to you.
Right, thank you, everybody. Now, for me, let me just get this here. You can do this one of two ways. If you want to put a question in the chat bar, I can answer it, or you can buzz in. I don't want to limit the dialogue because I think what I'm about to share with you is very important to me in the sense of where I'm at. So I want to say welcome. I want to say thanks. I would say thanks to your colleagues. You know, when I discovered this document a few weeks back about innovative approaches or pedagogy in the classroom, one of the chapters was on hip hop. I thought, you know, something, I'm gonna holler at these people. I'm gonna get in touch. And when I did, Mark got in touch, and then some of the researchers got in touch, and it's just been going on. But what today's really about is for me to offer out the possibility of a dream. I'm interested in sharing. You know, my academic career is coming to an end soon because there's more urgent things for me to do with people like yourselves who may need what it is that I'm offering. So feel free to put a question in. I'm going to go through it. My journey, I'm 64 this year, and I've been around a long time. But what happened is I came to academia late. So I did my PhD back in, I finished it in 2013. So it's only 7 or 8 years. Prior to that, I was a frontline practitioner, but I was a clever practitioner working in criminal justice because I used to regularly spar. I suppose I was like Piers Morgan, that I wasn't a politician, but I could argue with politicians. I could argue because I was raised that way from school days, being head boy, and communication was always important to me. When I went into academia, I remember growing up, I used to despise academics. I couldn't understand the language of the journal articles. I didn't understand what a conference was about. It just made no sense. Because in the world in which I lived, which was the streets, prisons, that didn't mean nothing. You know, when I'm working with somebody in prison who's committed murder, those things didn't mean much. When I went into academia, I did my master's and then I did my doctorate. I suddenly became aware of the importance of theory. I became the importance of pedagogy. I just suddenly realized that actually I'd been socialized away from education to make a difference. So I got into academia, and the usual thing when you get in, you know, how many articles are you going to publish this year? Have you done this and that? And I was never comfortable with it because my work predominantly focuses on issues of race, diversity. And in the first 2 or 3 years postdoctorate, I couldn't get no work published in academic journals. Just couldn't get it done. But because I was working in prisons and the community, I was constantly being asked, what are you doing? Where's your work? When are you going to publish the findings of that research you did on us or with us? So about 5 years ago, I hit a crisis point. And as I said, you know, what was said before, I've been a spoken word artist, a comedian. I've written for Casualty, Radio 4. So I've always been an artist. If you look behind me, you'll see pictures. I'm also a craft artist. But academia, they tried to beat that out of me. So I'd kind of forgotten that I used to speak lyrics. I'd forgotten I used to compose songs. I'd forgotten that I'd staged theatre. So I get a call. I'd risen up the ranks. I became well known in academia, in my work in criminal justice here and around the world. But in my university, there was still a kind of dampening on my work around race and crime. So I was invited to do a keynote speech for the American Society of Criminology, the biggest conference probably in the world. And I got my usual 20 minutes, 8,000 word speech to talk about mass incarceration. And I looked at it and thought, no, I can't go to New Orleans. So the first thing I thought, I'm going to read it out to jazz. So I got in touch with the organizer and said, look, can you send me some jazz musicians? And they said yes. And then I thought, nah, I want to do that. I want to perform my speech. So I used thematic analysis, deconstructed it, rhymed it, and suddenly I'd got this 4 pages of A4 that was rhymed. And suddenly I didn't know what it was. All I knew is I wanted to present it using hip hop. So I went down to a recording studio with some disgruntled hip hop producers who one cold Saturday morning produced a piece of music that was 11 minutes long. We recorded it. We didn't know what we'd done. We just looked at each other in amazement because this beat and me recording it didn't have a name. Anyway, I thought this is exciting. This is fun. I didn't have any ideas that it was going to be taken seriously. I just thought I've got an innovative way to present my research. Anyway, unbeknownst to me, these hip hop producers had never seen anything like it. They'd never heard any academic speak their research to hip hop. They were all saying, "Yo, Martin, I didn't know that, and I didn't know this." So I left it. I said, "Well, it's interesting, great exercise." Behind my back, they started putting it onto hip hop programs. They started putting it around the community in barbershops, and there was a buzz about it, but they never told me. And I just thought, oh, that's it. Anyway, there was one morning, I think it was a Tuesday morning, about 9 o'clock, I woke up, suddenly found out that they'd sent it to Busta Rhymes, one of America's, the world's leading hip hop artist. He got 8 million followers, and he retweeted it. And then that went to I'll have a look at that in a minute, Mark. And then they put the track out. It went to Black Lives Matter. They retweeted it, and then within a week, we got 30 million like retweets from retweeting, because with 8 million and exponentially. Yeah. The track that is up there, Ode to Rosa, I'll give a story about that in a minute, because that is another story in itself. Anyway, we did it. I thought nothing of it, but somehow the community in the streets took notice of it. When we launched this track called Silenced, we sent it out to a gang member, and when I was presenting it live in a recording studio, this gang member had memorized, he couldn't read and write, and he'd memorized the whole track. And he performed it alongside me, 11 minutes. I don't know how the hell he did it. That gave birth to what is now called data verbalization. I didn't have a title for it, but I remember at the same time, I got this book on data visualization. And I thought, well, hold on, if you present things visually, you still have to speak about it. And I thought, how can I have a title for what I've just done? And I thought visualization, and then I put data verbalization. And it was a good marketing tool, because what would happen is that when I talked about it and I said data verbalization, people said, don't you mean data visualization? I said, no. And then they said, well, what's that? And then it reached around Europe. I did an album. I did so many things with it. Now, what's just been put into the chat? There's a track called Ode to Rosa. One of the world's leading criminologists, a guy called Shad Maruna, who I've known for years, he'd written this article called about reformed offenders forming a movement like the civil rights movement. And it was in the Irish Probation Journal, very dense article, but basically advocating that offenders should represent themselves. And he got in touch with me and said, look, Martin, can you do something with my article? And I took it, I reworked it, we put it to hip hop, we put a video with it, not a video, like a montage, a video montage. And if you go on YouTube, you'll see it. Anyway, that was the first time I did it for another academic. And in America, it went crazy. In fact, they referred to it as D-Rap because his work was around desistance. That's why I called it desistance as a social movement. And they called it D-Rap. So it went from Chicago it went all over the place. And that made me realize that, you know something, if I can do this for other academics. And so, to cut a long story short, The Guardian came a ride calling. They'd heard about it. I'd done a lot of publicity, and I still wasn't into it as much. I just thought it's something that's interesting. The Guardian came along and they said, we've heard about this thing called data verbalization. And I remember being interviewed and I said, look, a lot of academic research. And I used the term intellectual masturbation. And I got that term from somebody on the streets who that's what they defined what we do as. And they printed it in the Guardian and it went around the world. From it went around the world, I was then getting offers from Colombia to researchers who were marginalized came a calling, basically. And then from all of this, just before that, the community was saying, Mark, you need to do a book. So I went to Routledge and I said to Routledge, I want to do a book about speaking research data. And a lot of my colleagues have scoffed at it and they laughed at it. And then the moment Routledge, I think within 3-4 months, I got the commission and I wrote the book for Routledge. So the context is just to say that before we get into the actual what it's all about, if I look at retweets and views on YouTube and all the other stuff that I can't even keep track of, it's in excess of 100 million. So the context is simply that I wanted to bring what we're doing onto the streets, because what we do affects communities, and I wanted to make sure the community could listen to it through their headphones on their screens and bypass the conference, because the conference circuit in the peer review journal for me was me doing comedy and talking to comedians. I didn't want to do that. My work is in criminal justice, and the people that need to hear what I've done is the streets, our criminal justice agencies, but it was that area that was missing. So that's the context. So that led me to then look wider at creative dissemination, because, you know, I've created this method. That's all it is. It's a method. But I wanted to look wider at creative dissemination, because for people like yourselves, we're in lockdown. And if you're going to get paid big chunks of money, where the real money is made in terms of impact is not on the research itself. It's actually how it impacts on the community. You've only got to see with the COVID-19 and the vaccine. The messaging has been so bad that communities, especially the community I come from, the term BAME, nobody asked if I wanted to be called BAME. Nobody really looked at social inequality and health. And if they did, they didn't present it in a way that people I talked to could understand it. So I wanted to look further at creative dissemination. But I had to start with saying to my critics, yeah, we have Black Lives Matter. We've got the Me Too campaign. So when it comes to the human condition, human beings matter. But I wanted to say data stories matter. Why do they matter? Is because we spend hours and weeks and months and years researching, getting ethical approval, having difficult relationships, getting depressed, struggling to do what we love doing, whether you're a farmer, whether you're working on, you know, space exploration, it makes no difference. Whatever data you're producing it matters. But what's happened is, and I've watched this over the years when research was always discredited. Well, bad research should be discredited, but even bad research, it's like pulling statues down, you know, or people daubing Winston Churchill's statue. My thing is there's something to learn from bad research as there is to celebrate good research, but data stories matter. And so my passion, my energy, and I went back to this, that if I'm taking research to the streets, then the data stories I'm telling matter to the people that I'm trying to talk to. And in this particular instance, with some of my work, it was not academics, it was not politicians. It was mothers who wanted to find out more. Martin, can you help me understand why my son shot somebody? Can you help me understand about mass incarceration? Can you help me understand these things? So I have to lead by example. And one of the things about what I've tried to do is develop a process of leadership. You cannot just come up with what I'm doing without leading. So it is like civil rights. You cannot, you know, I not only have to do the research, I have to justify this approach. So my starting point to keep my energy going is data stories matter. One of the first things that I came up against is when I started to look, when other researchers would contact me, they'd say, well, Martin, here's an article about women in offending. Can you do something with the data? And I say, oh yeah, I can help you out. But then I said, what lens do you look at your work from? And they would tell me it was monocultural. It could be a feminist agenda, regardless of what it is. But what happened is, and I go back to the situation with George Floyd, when George Floyd was murdered, there was a massive issue in the States around the treatment of black men by the police. But the lens in which you view it, so we had Donald Trump, who was looking at it through a really right-wing lens. we had other people looking at it through this lens. But if you look at it through an intersectional lens, which is the intersection of different social locations, then your analysis becomes stronger. So one of the key things for me about research is that, and it's a question, it's an existential question. When we are investigating things, what lens are we viewing it from? I know as a black man, I've always been viewed through the lens of other white men who haven't bothered to understand my history, politics, cultural context, and hasn't had a lens to do that. So it means that the way in which I'm viewed is flawed. And we've seen this with COVID-19 in the way that the evidence is looking at social inequalities, but I don't see a lot of research being put out there about what social inequality in health is. So one of the key things for me as a starting point for yourselves is that to get a diverse audience, it's the lens that you view the original source material, which ethically is really important to me. And basically, here's just for those of you not used to intersectionality: race, class, environment, gender, age, health, sexuality, education, culture, faith. I mean, there's lots more. The relevance of it is looking at multiple social locations gives you a broader and more complex idea than just looking at black men. Black men are poor, so they may be working class black men. They may come from an inner city environment, which means that's not the same as a rural or suburban. They may be gay, which means you could have gay black men from the inner city who are middle class. There may be young gay black men with HIV. My point being is intersectionality was developed by people like Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, women. So as a male researcher, I had to kind of contest and contend with re-looking at my own lens to be able to find a lens that's commensurate. So when I share my research, people feel that it's an inclusive lens. And that's why if you go to the track that Mark put on there, Ode to Rosa, you'll see how I've had to approach intersectional ways of presenting the performative approach to the data. So the lens in which we view our research is, for me, is ethically very important. I did a presentation recently, and people said they've never really heard this word for a long time, the word bricoleur. When I was growing up, I always never had a go-kart, and I always wanted to make a go-kart. So I made a go-kart of an orange box, pram wheels, string. So a bricoleur is somebody who's like a handy person who just makes something out of lots of bits and pieces. As a bricoleur researcher, somebody who uses bricolage, it's multi-perspectival, multi-theoretical, multi-methodological, because when I talk about research dissemination, all I heard was conference, peer-reviewed journal. And that's just one perspective. That's what the academic route is. But if you're communicating with inner city people, you're sharing in prison, you're working with blind people, you're sharing, as I've done, with drug addicts, women who are victims of domestic violence. You can't do it in that conventional way. Like COVID-19, you can't just have a conference where you get people together. And a lot of the people I work with are at risk when you're dealing with victims and perpetrators of crime. So I needed to have an intellectual justification for the choice of doing this type of work. And so I discovered bricolage research in education. I had to bring it into a criminal justice perspective. And the beauty about it is I managed with the multi-perspectives, multi-theoretical, multi-methodological. And when I understood how to do bricolage research, it meant that the dissemination, the way that I did it, fell into place. So again, if you're thinking about this, there is a justified ethical position as a bricoleur if you're going to do an evaluation of the impact of what you've done. It's not, oh, it's just creative. No, it's not, as you'll see in a minute. Reach and impact. I told you we've had 100 million in 4 years, and that's reach, and that's great, but that's not how you measured. It's about impact. You and I both know that if we look at COVID's affected millions, but it's only impacted in terms of the point of death for 100 or so thousand people who's in hospital. It's reached millions, and that's important. But the impact, there's social impacts, there's cultural impacts, there is physical impact. So for me, what I wanted to do with data verbalization is not just reach. I wanted to look at impact, because impact is where you're measured. Impact is where you can gauge the temperature. Impact is important. I suffer from migraines, so when I take an Anodin, the impact is when my headache subsides. So in a lot of the work that I've done with data verbalization, I've been asked to come in to spaces and places to generate impact. So one of the things you'll get now, since Black Lives Matter, is white researchers saying, look, Martin, I want to share my research with the black community. Can you show me how I can have some impact as a white person? And I'll say, okay. So the piece I did for Ode to Rosa was not, Shad never wrote it for black people, but he wanted marginalized groups to engage with his work. So by putting it to hip hop and jazz hip hop, what we did, we generated a lot of impact in prisons, in the community with his work. So again, central to this is to wrestle with reaching impact. And what I can tell you, if you use music and the way that I do it, not only can you exponentially increase your reach, by reaching more people, you increase your impact. So really, it's a key thing to consider. So let's get to some of the ones that we do. Most of you know about data visualization. Data visualization goes without saying. You and I both know when it comes to statistics, data visualization is like the benchmark, but even visually. I come from a community that's very visually literate, from we raise t-shirts, hats, baseball caps, merchandising. I've never seen data visualization on a t-shirt or a baseball cap. So there's a way to put data visualization in areas where people access it. I know if I put statistics, like when George Floyd died, his face was on t-shirts. That was data visualization, because that was saying this man died because he was murdered. Gang members, when they're murdered, they have a t-shirt with his name, date of birth. So I would say that data visualization is also quite limited in a sense that it puts charts and everything on PowerPoints. But as you notice with the NHS, they're now using TikTok, Instagram Live. They're going to those mediums where the average person can access them. So data visualization, I'm saying there's new ways to do data visualization. And what I'm playing around with is different ways to visualize data that people understand. So when I wear a t-shirt and I've got some information on it, people read it. They'll come up to my chest and say, yo, what's that on your chest? That's data visualization. But in the way that a lot of academics see it, they just see it as this way that is to do at a conference to show statistics cleverly. Well, there's more ways to do that. And one of the best data forms of data visualization is Egyptian hieroglyphs. Go to indigenous communities, the Maoris, Native Americans. They've been visualizing their data for thousands of years. So therefore, I wanted to check, well, I have raised some questions about what culturally, what constitutes data visualization. There's the tradition and there's other things. So that's data visualization. Ethnodrama, ethnotheatre. Back in the day, I was a researcher on glaucoma, mental health, anxiety management. And ethnodrama is really dramatizing data. And I started where I did a big piece of work on glaucoma with African Caribbean people and with surgeons who operated on African Caribbean people. And they asked me to look at the patient's journey. So I would interview people who lost their sight and got their sight back with glaucoma, elderly Caribbean people, young people. And so I wrote the report, did what you're supposed to do. I wrote up the report and I got the findings ready and I got the PowerPoint all set to do what you're supposed to do. And there was a conference of about 200 surgeons, glaucoma surgeons, and they asked me to speak in the voices of the data. And it ranged from sounding like my grandfather, where you get elderly Caribbean people. I remember one guy in his 80s and he got his sight restored. And when I interviewed him, I said, Percy, what did it feel like when you got your eyes back? And if I'd have written it on the, the report, it would have gone, I was very happy I got my sight restored. And then I would do some analysis. Percival responded it. I didn't do that. I went into the comments and said, well, yes, I'm glad I get my eyesight back. I'm really happy that suddenly his voice came out. I had a young guy called Kieran. He was 19. He'd lost his sight to glaucoma, which challenged the assumption that young people don't lose their sight to glaucoma. And I remember speaking to him, and I was trying to get across to the surgeons. This is how he sounded when I asked him the same question: what did it feel like when you lost the sight? And I could have done. And Kieran got agitated, but I showed people. He paced up and down. And, yo, you see me? Yeah, and he started to perform it. So in my work in prisons, when I do research, I go back to the people I research with. And rather than me write a report for the prison governor or the commissioning agency, I would work with the prisoners to stage their data and where they speak their interview to people that needed to hear it. And I did that for 20 odd years, because what I realized is I couldn't get my work out there on peer reviewed journals because they didn't touch race and crime. Universities were not really that interested in the stories of prisoners. So I use ethnodrama and ethnotheatre, where I would use real data and dramatize it. And because I come from a drama background, I was in a position to create what we call faction. You've seen it with Ricky Gervais in The Office, where you take a fictitious space with real dialogue. And so what I do is take the actual research data and qualitative interviews, but put it in a fictitious situation. So that's ethnodrama. So that's another way that I've worked and that you can use. Autoethnography, working in criminal justice, frequently with gang members and other people that I work with, especially offenders, people on death row. They always want to know, how did I find doing the research? Did I find it stressful? And reflexively, we never really use reflexivity. We use it to be able to account for whether the research is valid. But in my work, autoethnography becomes what Alan Bennett does in terms of monologues. So I developed my own form of performance ethnography, so that when I went back to prisons and the community, I would present through monologues my journal or my diary. That would then show people, this is what I went through, this is how I did it, this is what I felt like. And in some respects, I was working in America with some very dangerous men, and I went native. I was talking to a gang member, and I realized that I couldn't ask him the questions that I was supposed to ask. I just couldn't. There was other things I wanted to talk to him about that was more urgent. So I spoke to him about gangs, murder, and I spoke to him as a father because I was concerned about my son. And I remember when I got back to England in the PhD, I wrote it down and I couldn't use it as part of my research. But what I had to do is include it in the methodology, because what I realized is that I'd reached the limit, and I went native, and I wanted to share with other researchers, not just let them read how I went native. I wanted to show them. So the performative autoethnography was very dramatic. It was, you can see my hands moving now. It was full of gesture, the oscillation in my voice, the pausing, the fear, the anxiety. So once again, as part of the research process to connect to community, I wanted to show that I'm a human being, and this is what I found difficult about doing it. So performance autoethnography is something that Norman Denzin, the very famous Norman Denzin, is an advocate of, but I took it and put it into a more performative context in front of the people that I'd researched with, and community and policymakers who'd say, when you're working with offenders, can you describe the experience? So it comes to data verbalization. I know what data verbalization is communicating and disseminating research using performance approaches. I had one objective, is to put my research into people's headphones. And so it means if you go on YouTube, if you go on iTunes, Spotify, put your headphones on, you can listen to it. You can play it any time of the day. The relevance of it means that people can play it through their system in the car, when they're in a sauna. So with data verbalization, whereas with the others, data visualization, you need a setup, really. Space. Ethnodrama, you need a space. Autoethnography, yes and no, but data verbalization, you record it, perform it, put it on a platform, everybody can hear it. And I've had academics go into a conference and they've used data verbalization, and they'll play it and let everybody listen to it and then talk about it. So it's quite popular, but from a community point of view, it means you can listen to it any time of the day. You can listen to it on your phone, in your headphones, even on your watch. But if you're a purist, you're going to say, well, Martin, don't you think that's, you know, is that really good? Well, it depends what you research. I research criminal justice. What I do know is I've got a huge take up based on what I've done. So maybe I can't answer that question. Maybe it's the audience who you need to ask them. So that's data verbalization. This is the framework. You take the data, you adapt the data, you put music. The music in the deconstruction contains the key messages. That creates the experience. Because like Starbucks, like Apple, Samsung, in order to create impact, you've got to create the experience. And to take data from the adaptation to the music, to the message, to the experience, that's what creates the impact, is the experience. People will come to me and say, Martin, I love that track. Can I read the research? Can I read your book? People start to embed and immerse themselves in what I'm researching, but it starts with the data. So data verbalization is not research. It's what you do with research to create the experience of the research that connects people to it to generate reach and impact. And that's the framework. And can anybody do it? Yeah, anybody can perform. I've had people do it to classical music. I've never met anybody say want to do it to country and western, but you could, because the essence of country and western is like data. It's all about, you know, if the early days of country and western, classical music. Because the beauty about music and words collaboration, you could call it opera, operetta, musical theatre. The relation between music and lyrics goes without saying. All that's happened is the source material is data, research data, that's all. So, just want to get this done because I want to get into some questions. The future. I've done data verbalization, it works. I'm interested in working with other people who want to try it out, play with it. I've developed a training program for researchers. I've developed a module for students, you know, that's all waiting to be unleashed. But the future, and this is hopefully where we can have some discussion, get you excited about the future. Podcasts, you've got this video. If you go on Spotify, you'll hear the album. There's about 10 tracks. You'll hear that it's all research based, talking podcasts, all sorts of it's there. But to drive it, I set up a data storytelling lab, because data storytelling is wider than just data verbalization. So I've set up a laboratory process for people to access and play around with, and me work with them. So podcasts. I do talking podcasts, very different to what you normally see. So I use hip hop, jazz, reggae music to do podcasts. Take 800 words, deconstruct it, boom, talking podcast. We call it Jcasting. That's why you'll notice on the thing it says Jcast podcast. Jcasting just stands for jazzcasting. The first time I ever spoke a podcast to jazz, everybody loved it. If you're into jazz, oh my God, what's that? So we find we can get musical audiences and academics. So that's the future, new podcast. Digital praxis. Spoke to some of your colleagues about this. Augusto Boal did it through theatre. He used theatre in prisons to actualize praxis. Digital praxis is different. I'm in a community at the moment that doesn't go out, is impacted by COVID. So how do I transform them in the digital space? And what I'm finding is now, I'm finding some very interesting ways to actualize praxis where people can represent themselves for the first time on these mediums in the way that they can't do in a council house, or, you know, like when they go to the town hall, or they can't go to these big meetings. There's a kind of democratization that's come with these platforms. And so data verbalization is helping giving people a voice online that they can actualize some of their concerns without me stepping in and becoming the big I am. So that's the next big thing, especially for Indigenous peoples. I mean, I've been asked to look at some stuff in Australia and the Caribbean. These are all embryonic discussions, but the word digital praxis has become, oh my God, I didn't think about that. Data-driven cinema. Got a new book coming out soon. And I've been approached by an American producer who's saying, look, can we turn your book into a movie? And there's movies like James Baldwin's I'm Not Your Negro, The 13th by Ada DuVernay. And these are like historical biopics with snippets of things that people say, like narration. What I want to get is research data and adapt it and convert it into a cinematic form, so that when, rather than have fake news, I'm saying that for Netflix, BritBox, Apple TV, I envisage that we will move toward data-driven cinema, where stories will be driven by research data and dramatized to suit it. Because I've already done short films on this, but what I'm interested in exploring, somebody who might have a PhD thesis becomes a movie. Meeting someone who's doing postdoctoral research becomes a movie. So once again, the future is out there. I mentioned this morning, performative data journalism. I'm currently talking to journalists around data journalism is just doing journalism, but through research. But what I've said, if you take murder, we've had a murder in Birmingham recently, and the young people were 15 who were implicated. How are you going to get to those 15-year-olds? If you're writing about mental health and young people and violence, how are you going to communicate it to them in a way that they understand? It's all right writing it in the Sun and the Daily Mail, but young people do want to know about news, but they want to access news according to the way they experience it. So I'm working on performative data journalism, which is to take journalism, deconstruct it, and present it through performance in a way that is more emotionally impacting. And again, some journalists are up for it, but there's a fear, and I understand that because it's performative. So these are 3 of my books. Black Men, Invisibility and Crime was my PhD, adapted, Routledge. And I've done several ethno-dramas that have emerged from there. And everybody's been asking me to put it into a movie, especially like now, post George Floyd. So I'm getting that request, but I did that in 2014. The book, Speaking Data and Telling Stories, that's for those of you that want to get a resource. Again, I wrote the book not for my benefit. I wrote it because everybody said, how do you do it? And I thought, well, I always love the way academics say, read my book. And in this particular case, when people come and say, I say, look, read the book. But I wanted to leave it as a legacy project as well. And the next book, which is out in May, called Reimagining Black Art and Criminology. And that's because there's a fact, you know, if you know anything about sociology, there's a book called The Sociological Imagination. From that, another book was produced called The Criminological Imagination. And C. Wright Mills and Jock Young wrote those books, but they didn't really have a position around race. And also, the criminological imagination, sociological imagination doesn't unpack kind of where we are right now. And when George Floyd was murdered, the first people to spring into action were graffiti artists and rap artists and gospel artists. It wasn't social scientists. And therefore, I wanted to reimagine the criminological imagination through the lens of black art, because historically, black artists, black arts movements were led by intellectuals. They were led by far back as the early 20th century. They've always been led by intellectuals, and art has become the vehicle to communicate intellectual ideas to the community. So rather than just, settle for data verbalization, I wanted to look at my discipline and say, in the area of race and crime, which people are really bad at focusing on, maybe it's the researcher who's creative and the artist who's intellectual stand a better chance of making sense of mass incarceration, street violence. The relevance of it is, and I've got a 4th book coming out in 2023, which is about the black presence in crime and punishment from 1750 to 1900. The relevance of it is, I've had several offers from American documentary producers to produce the book, because at this moment in time, there's no history book on the black presence in crime and punishment from the Regency period to the reign of Queen Victoria. I'm the first person ever to have done that, because there can't be just David Alashoga and there can't just be Lucy Worsley. In crime and punishment, none of them deal with crime and punishment, whereas that's my area, that's my passion. So the point I'm trying to make is, I started out as an artist, a poet, spoken word, doing all of this stuff. Did radio for Casualty, theatre, you name it. I've been there, seen it, done it. Got my PhD, did the masters. But it's taken me 40 years to realize that. And when I started my PhD, people said, what's your contribution to knowledge? I wrote my PhD. That was the basis of the PhD, the doctorate. But I realized there's a broader statement. When somebody challenges you and says, what's your contribution to knowledge? I'm not going to put my PhD in that category. My contribution to knowledge that's taken 40 odd years is where I'm at now. Because the doctorate is not the sole domain of knowledge. Epistemologically speaking, there is folklore, mythology, there is visual arts. So therefore, my contribution to knowledge and ideas is one, the legacy that I'm going to leave behind, because when we're gone, we're gone. So I didn't want to have a situation where when I leave this earth, there's nothing left behind. And as you know about doctorates, only 2 people read them, your examiner and a couple of other people. My books are read around the world. I don't really read my books because it's not really my thing. They're there for other people to pull apart and to use. What I will say with data verbalization, the idea of doing data-driven movies, the idea of adapting research and presenting it to constituencies, whether your constituent is blind and they want it in Braille, whether it's people suffering from autism and they want an immersive experience, a sensory experience. For me, I'm just a conduit and a tool. I'm interested in connectivity. I'm ready to leave the comfort of academia, of students. Because when I met your colleagues, and I'm not saying this because we're on this thing, your colleagues, in the conversation I've had with them, been very open and honest and say, look, Mark, you need some support. We'd like you to get involved. I'm saying to you guys right now is that my time for doing what I've done has come to an end. My work, and I've got probably 30 articles I've written. There's so much stuff I've done, but it's done. It's what I'm focused on now. And I remember, if I go back to that globe and the connections, I see I have a valuable contribution to make, to assist, work alongside, collaborate with, co-produce with other researchers where we can unapologetically transcend academia, but let communities understand that what we're doing comes from an academic source, but now you can pick it up and run with it. Because in public and social policy, what I've noticed is communities can only take their data and information so far. It's left to academics and people involved in policy and analysts that can take it to that next level. And all I want before I leave this earth is to leave a mark where we're not leaving it just to fake news, where we're not important pieces of research, they're not left on a shelf and they're not dying a death. So I'm going to stop now because I want to leave 15 minutes for questions, and it's really important that you ask me questions because I'm really, really keen for us to connect. So I'm going to stop there and just really take any questions, thoughts, and then I'll conclude by let's see where we can take it. So I'll hand it back over to you guys now to start, and let's fire some questions.
Martin, can I start?
Yep.
Denise here. How do you go about deconstructing, move the data into a new medium?
First and foremost, it's quite simple. Well, Denise, forgive me when I say it's simple, because it's not. I mean, I know when I see Gordon Ramsay prepare food, it looks simple until I have a go. You know what I mean? But basically what you do is use thematic analysis. And what will happen is, if you look at an academic paper, there's a lot of repetition. The convention is a lot of repetition. There is a lot of superfluous information. What I do is deconstruct the whole thing and take it apart at the seams. And then what you realize is in the deconstruction, there are sentences. And normally what happens with thematic analysis, you group the sentences together and you do more thematic analysis until you end up with one theme. What I do is I take all of the themes and rhyme them. And then I rhyme them and then structure them narratively like I'm writing a play. So there's a coherent structure, because when you look at an academic paper, you've got the abstract, the introduction, and in some respects, from a narrative point of view, sometimes it's not coherent. Whereas what you do is you apply narrative structure with thematic analysis, and then I work with producers and put the music with it, and then we voice it. So as a process, it's quite complex, but the outcome is like when you go and eat to a 5-star restaurant. When you get that chicken or the fish or whatever you're eating, you don't really try to deconstruct the seasoning in it. But if it's cooked right with the right ingredients, you say, I'm coming back to this restaurant. And I would say, if I gave somebody that I would probably identify with in terms of my process, I would say Heston Blumenthal. He completely deconstructed the way we use food, but people love it. And what I've done is completely deconstructed the research initially. Is it possible? Yes. But it's just that, like me, I've had to justify it. I've had to do so many different ways to get it out there. But it's deconstruction, and repackaging it. And what you say is like cinema. I'll just come to your question in a minute, Mark. I had a colleague of mine who sat at the back of a lecture theatre, and when I told him what I was doing, he started laughing. So I asked him if he loved Charles Dickens, and he said, yeah. And I said, well, Charles Dickens, there's more film adaptations of Charles Dickens, and more people have seen Charles Dickens adaptations in cinema than have read his books. It's just a different medium. So therefore, my argument is, all I've done is taken research into a different medium, not destroy the initial research. There are ethical considerations like any particular process, but what I'll say is the evidence speaks for itself. And all it requires is people to have a go and to play. And you remember, as academics, we're not used to playing, whereas I like to play. So that's what it's about. That question there that Mark's put, music has a strong tradition of response songs, battles between performers and sequence of pieces. Have you tried engaging in a serious research conversation rebuttals through this form? You're put in a position all the time. I just to show you, right, here's the thing. I will have a group of students online, and there'll be an academic says, yeah, but how do you communicate to this generation? But the moment I do this, I can take you to a place people don't like walking. You have to watch your step in the area you are talking. You don't have the money, so you have to hustle. You need a clever brain and not a rippling muscle. The moment I'm starting to throw it down and there's a rhyme in there, so not only can you rebut people, not only can you present it, you can make that same individual go, oh my God. Now, here's another way. If you're into classical music, because how do you do it with classical music? Well, I studied everybody from Rodgers and Hammerstein, Gilbert and Sullivan. And I remember one time I was working with a group of 75-year-olds who they were into classical music. And they remember this, if you know anything about HMS Pinafore, I am the very model of a modern major general. Well, I wrote another version because people said, yeah, but do you respect our intellectual, do you respect our traditions? You're black from the inner city. Are you going to come and talk to us about reggae music? And I said, I am the very model of a modern oral genius. My style is fast and furious because I am spontaneous. I know you might, boom. Suddenly I'm using a classical sound with contemporary lyrics, and they loved it. I can do it with rock music. So it's in the adaptation. So for me, there's nothing off limits. So Mark, for me, if it's not going to be contentious and awkward and challenging, well, what's the point in doing it? Because it then becomes the norm. I don't want to do anything that's the norm. What I do know is when you listen to Andrew Lloyd Webber's musicals, why do we cry? Because of the combination of lyrics and music. Tim Rice and Andrew Lloyd Webber, Elton John and Bernie Taupin, Rodgers and Hammerstein, Gilbert and Sullivan, so therefore the process of constructing data verbalization is collaborative. It's not individual. And if you're not used to working collaboratively with producers and musicians, it's going to be hard. But I wanted to make the democratization of what I do more collaborative, so it works. There's no type of music or experience that you can't give me. I've done stuff with magnesium, of all things, where an academic asked me to do something with his work on magnesium, and I thought, how am I going to do this? He'd written a book on magnesium. But I remember the excitement that I found at school when you lit magnesium in water and it just went round and it was just bright, nearly, and I thought, if I can create a piece that shows the excitement I had as a child, that's what I did. So yes, I think that what happens is people get scared because they think, oh, it's not my thing. I created something that for everybody to use. So most of the work with other academics is trying to reassure them that it's okay to play. It's okay to have some fun. But when you sing it, when you rap it, when you speak it as a monologue, trust me, it's a transformative experience. So next question, keep asking. We've only got a few more minutes left. So anybody else wants to come in? Don't leave me hanging.
I've got a question for you, Martin. It's
Who's
Rod
this?
Earl.
Oh, Rod. Rod!
Hi there. Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for that really great presentation. I've known a bit about Martin's work for some time, and it's great to see you at the Open University, Martin.
Well, you remember when I was in London and you saw me perform?
Yeah, you did. That's it. I think you sent the symposium flying. It was fantastic. And the sort of question I have is partly a question, I think, but what I've loved about your work is the way you sort of blur these boundaries, which is disorienting. I find it disorienting. I don't know whether I'm listening to an artist or I'm listening to a scientist, and you kind of mix the boundaries between art and the science, between research and data, art and agitation. So partly I was kind of going to ask you a little bit about how you see others perhaps in your field, because I think one of the most influential artists of recent years has been Steve McQueen, and his series Small Acts seems to do something really special, which connected. While you were talking, I thought about the way you are talking about visualization, verbalization, the telling of the transformation, if you like, of data into stories.
Well, in responding to that, Rod, first, thanks for that question. And there's a couple of responses. First and foremost, sometimes the provocative nature is not by design. It never goes out to shock or I'm just a bricklayer. I just put lots of things together. But one of the things that provocation does, it opens a dialogue. So sometimes when I'm using data verbalization, it's positioned like when I was at the conference in London to start a conversation. But when I had a situation where I was invited to Colombia, where I was asked to work with Colombian hip hop artists who were working with Colombian researchers, with farmers to get them to stop growing cocoa. And they got data to show that you can use the land for other things. But the researchers didn't know how to present the data to the farmers. But the hip hop artists knew how to talk to the farmers, but didn't know about data. And they asked me if I'd work together. And I think really, I would say this, the deeper issue is not blurring the boundaries. It's to work in partnership where you respect the boundaries that everybody has and navigate and create new boundaries. It's a bit like disciplining a child. They're going to push boundaries and then eventually you put new boundaries in the way. And a bit like Steve, remember, I come from a marginalized group. And so maybe if I could speak to white people in the way that other white people can, maybe I wouldn't do it. Maybe, but what I do say is this, is that I believe that a lot of academics are desperate and starved of validation around dreams and ideas they have. When I did Shad Maruna's work, he was over the moon. He just couldn't believe that I did what he did. Your work, I mean, the work that with the British Society of Criminology, I remember when there was a lot of toing and froing go back. If I was to write my response to this stuff, I wouldn't be writing it in ways that it's going to be more poetic. It's going to be more direct. I'm just going to get straight to the point. So therefore, if I look at English literature, whether it's Chaucer, whether it's Byron, whether it's Wordsworth Daffodils, language, lyrics provokes response. And I think one of the things that I want to do with my work is bring data into what we feel, not to what we think. And so therefore, I know it might sound strange, but if I said at a conference, I'd like to create research data where we can feel it. I want to do what John Lee Hooker did. I want to do what Cliff Richards did when he sings Summer Holiday, so that my mum could say, oh yeah, I didn't realize that was about premenstrual tension. So my point being is that unless I'm working alongside people like yourself, so I can navigate those boundaries and those fears and anxieties. So I look at it, I'm part of a continuum. I've made my contribution. Now I need to be able to test this in a range of different situations where it's not me speaking about it, it's people like yourself speaking on behalf of your experience of it, not me telling you about the method. So thanks for that, Rod. I see Denise has come back on. So
Martin, I have to go now because I've another meeting, but I would like all of us to take your mics off and give Martin a big round of applause, because it was a very stimulating presentation.
That sounds to me like performing in a Northern Working Men's Club, but there's only like 10 people in on a Friday.
But thank you, Martin. I've got to go, but other people might want to, carry on the discussion. But we'll be in touch soon, and thank you very much.
Well, I'm just going to stay on. Thank you very much.